Let's clean this mess of include files and have one include that will do all of this inclusion automatically for us. That way we don't have to include a class manually ever again. PHP will do that boring part for us. If you're not following our CMS, here are the timestamps so you can jump straight to explanation and implementation of namespaces and auto-include. But we mentioned several times in our CMS that we will clean up this part at some point of multiple include statements here in our index file, here in admin and in public, and also Christian and Zekialik. And a few of you guys asked about auto-including the classes, so let's talk about auto-include functionality, namespaces, and the use keyword. First, let's add some functionality to our CMS. If you remember, we stopped at this listing of pages, and what we talked about is having the possibility to view, edit, or delete one page. So let's open one of the pages in a form by clicking the edit here so that we can update the actual page in the database later. So let's make one action in the admin page controller. So in our modules, that will be in the page admin and the page controller, right? So we can have one more action that will be called edit page action. If you recall, all of our actions have to end with the action special word. And here we can basically copy a lot of functionality from the default action because we still have the variables and the database in the page itself. However, instead of find, we are going to find one page, and that page we are going to get from the URL, right? So we will have one variable here that we can call the ID or page ID, and we are just going to get it from the get supl global called ID, I guess. And then we are going to find by field name will be the ID and the value will be page ID, right? Here we don't have a page handler, we are just going to have one page object. We are not going to return anything, we are just going to use our active record to get us the page that we are going to pass to the variables and that we are going to put into the view that we are about to make. So it's not page list, it's page edit. And that is in our module page, in our views. We are going to need one more file name page edit. Now we can pretty much copy everything from the list, or even better, we are going to use our free template that we had. And that is, if you recalled, in the admin/theme, when we integrated admin LTE template. And here under forms, for example, in the general elements, we can just grab one text and text area and one input file from the general elements, right? And then I'm looking for this path here, basically, the themes, pages, forms, general. So in our code, in the public folder, we have the theme, pages, forms, and general. And then we are looking for our general elements, not the navigation, but the actual elements. So from here, we can pick up the entire card with general elements. I'm not going to copy everything because we don't need all of it. We just need a few fields, and then we can just fix that HTML in our code here. Let me close all the divs that are not closed, and the form and a few other divs. Now inside our page controller, we should be quite ready. The only thing is reaching this actual page. So we need this action, edit page. And that is something we can actually do in the page listing here. We can link to our edit button, which is this one here. We can actually link to the action edit page. Then we can just reuse our URL from here. So that will be parameter action, right? Edit page. And we also need the page ID, right? Or we rather said the ID, and that we can just print, just like we did the page title, we can also print out the page ID. Now with any luck, this URL should lead us somewhere. We can even see that it is going to the action edit page, but we have one error. That is because I forgot to save this page controller. If I refresh one more time, we see that we have part of the form. Let's clean that up a bit. If I were to look at this page here, I can see that it has the content wrapper and the wrapper here. However, our page is lacking that content wrapper div, this one here. We are just starting with the cards, and that's why we are sort of overlapping with this side menu. Of course, we are also lacking the JavaScript to handle this side menu. That is something you can easily fix by watching the console and watching all the scripts that are needed for that one. I will quickly just add those missing divs. And the best way to fix that is inside our theme, which is in the view admin layout theme, the default theme, right? So we can just find our include of the central content, which is this one. And then we are going to add those missing divs, the content wrapper, and also the entire section with the class content. Now we can see that the general element now is positioned alongside this side section. And while I'm cleaning up, I noticed that this page controller is actually called dashboard controller. That's the copy-paste error that we're going to fix now with just calling it the page controller. And inside the admin, we also need to fix here the name of the page controller, as well as rename these variables to be the page controller, just so that we have it a bit cleaner. And now we have our form displaying something. It doesn't make sense of what is displaying because it's empty. So this text disabled can as well be removed from our form because we are not going to show any disabled fields. We're just going to show one title, which will be actually the page title, right? Or the page name, one could call it. And here instead of general elements, we can say the, I don't know, page ID, just to see that our ID is working, right? We can just say page ID. Let's just check if it's working. And we are getting the page ID 1, the same one from the URL. If we would to put ID 2, we will get our page with the ID number 2, which is exactly what we want. Now the page name and the text area need to actually show something. As a matter of fact, we don't even need this label here. And we can as well go without these columns. That's not very important for us right now. What is important is the actual page content. So this will be also page name, like a placeholder, but the value of this field needs to be printed out from our page. And then we can do the same with the page. And was it content, I believe? We can check our page model to see. Yes, it's the name. It is the content that's the name of this field. Sorry, this is the page name, right? That is the page title. Page title, and this one needs the page content. And here we can actually see that we have the homepage title and welcome to our homepage, which is actually what is our data from the database. If you recall our website, this is the data that we're displaying here. And if we would to go back to the list of pages, this doesn't work. Let's fix this URL, the pages. And that's the admin/index.php. And the module equals to page. And now if I click on it, we are back to the list of pages. And here we can see that if I would to click on the About Us page, we will get the About Us content and the About Us content of the page, right? But now to make this form work, actually to submit something, we need a button as well. We can maybe take this button from the quick example. So from our general, we are just going to copy this button, right? Submit. Just make sure it is inside the form so that it knows which form it needs to submit. And then when we click on it, right now nothing happens, but we want it to send this new modified data that we changed from here to the database or to our active record so that we can persist it in the database. And there are multiple ways of doing it. We could submit to a different action, to an edit page submit, for example, or we can just submit to the exactly the same action as we are now editing this page, so that our navigation will then happen here inside the edit page. And I often do that because it's easier to prepare the same data in the both showing and the submission of the data. It's just practical. So here we can just check if post contains some data. You can check on any field that you know it is there. I, however, just like to put one action here, and I just put it as a hidden field inside of our forms here. And that way we have one control field that will just inform our backend or our code that we are actually just submitting one form, some data. And then here in our controller, we can just var dump the post data just to see what we have here. And to make this form submit to the same place, we just need an empty action like we have it now. Now it is complaining that about the post because it is expecting always some action. We can easily fix that by either checking if action is empty or not. I can just do the null coalescent operator here, which will basically just give back the false if this action here is not set in the post actually. So we just avoid doing the if is set action, then return post action, otherwise return false. This is much shorter way of doing it with the null coalescent operator. If we try again, now everything is fine. If I would to change this about page to 1, for example, and content 1, even if I would to submit, it is going to action 1, which is actually not correct. And that is because our action method here needs to be post, right? Try one more time. And we can see that we are actually getting some data from the post. I might as well fix this sidebar one day. But it's saying that the action is 1 and the only value that's being sent with the post is this action, and that is because we don't have any names on our field. So let's quickly give the names to our input field, which will be the title, and our text area will have the name content, right? And the placeholder will be the page content. One more chance, and we can see that we also have this content of the page, the title and the content of the page, which has been changed now, and we have the action 1, and we also have the page ID, and that's all we need to update the database. But let's clean up this code a bit even more. I see that here in page controller we actually have this database get instance multiple times, so we can just delete it from here and we can just move it inside of our main controller initialization right here. So we can just initialize database over here and move this database connection inside of our page controller. We can even create this database connection inside of our, not the page controller, but inside of our main controller here as the public field, just so that we have it in all the places, just to make sure that everything is still working. We can see that it is not working, of course, because we didn't change this page controller. And here we don't have the database connection. We just have to use this database connection because this is in the page controller, referring to this controller, the one that we have just edited and added this field, right? Let's replace it here as well. And it still works. We have our list of pages, and then we can edit one of the pages, or we can see the value of that page here in the form. However, you probably noticed in this index PHP this huge clump of require ones, which is basically quite ugly to look at, but also quite impractical. Each time we would to add a new model, add a new validation rule or class or service or whatever, we would just need to go over here and include that file. It could impact the performance on huge files, but it's also quite cumbersome and easy to forget. Luckily, all this can be done automatically for us by using the PHP built-in autoloader feature. So if we would to Google for PHP autoloader, if I could spell, we could see that there is in the manual explained that the autoloading of the classes could be done with the SPL autoload register. So we can just copy this code from here and just replace all of this code with one single line. So if I would to refresh now, everything should still work. Of course, it will not work. And that is because we cannot just copy paste code. We need to understand what we are doing. So what this code is doing, it is basically just trying each time that PHP does not find the file. For example, here when we say database connection, if we don't include that database connection, the PHP will actually go inside this class and try to include this file here based on its class name, right? But to do that, we need to tell it how to do it and how to reach this database connection file. So what we can do is we can just use this root path, and instead of this actual name here, we are just going to put this variable here. And that way PHP will actually include our file from this source directory and this root path, if you recall that. If I were to refresh now, we can see that it went over the database connection, but is now complaining about this page. And the reason it is doing that, it is because the page is not inside the source map. It is inside the module path and the page and modules and page and PHP. Now I could manually just leave it here and try that way, and everything will still work, which means that bunch of these auto includes are now replaced with one single line. Because again, PHP, when it cannot find this include, it will go to our autoload register and it will use these rules here that we added so that it can resolve this class. But what we can do now is make a special rule for these models, because we have the control of this, right? So we could just check if the file exists, and we can just check the file name from here, the one that we are running here, right? If it exists, then we are going to include this one. But if not, we can even ask it to check for another file, right? Then we can just ask it to check for this page here. Let me copy that one and comment it from here. That way we can just use the module path and use the similar logic that we had from before. And then we are just going to include it if it's available. And now, even though we removed this include from here, everything should still work because it is managing to find our path based on this else if, right? If it's not in the source folder, well, it will just look into the page models, right? And it will find that class with the page. However, the user is now not working, and that is the one that we are using to log in, right? For that, we could do the same thing. We could just duplicate this if else, and instead of the page, we could just say the user. And then we can remove these final required ones, and then we basically can remove all of these required directives and just use our auto register, right? Much easier. However, I hope that you noticed that each time I was adding a module, I just needed to copy this if else. So we are technically having the code that is working for us. However, we still need to manually maintain it because we now, instead of bunch of includes, we have a bunch of if else's. And this is practically not much better than what we had when we started, right? Because if we again need to maintain the list of included files, then we might as well just have the this readable list here without any logic of it. Luckily, PHP has something called namespace, which will help us with this problem. Namespaces are a way of organizing our classes, our code, the similar way the file system organizes the files on our PC, right? So on our PC, we don't have just a bunch of files listed in one folder, right? We have them organized by namespaces, basically, which are the directories, the folders, right? Because apart from having a huge list of files, one of the bigger problems of having everything in one place is that we have the problem of having multiple files with the same name, right? Like here, for example, we will have one group of users, but then we might have as well one group of pages, and the file is named group.php, and that does not work. You cannot have two files with the same name, right? And the folders or the namespaces immediately solves that problem. So the easiest way to think about namespaces is to think about folders, right? They kinda work like folders for our classes, which means that we can organize and group them in some logical groups, just like folders, right? However, unlike folders, the namespaces in PHP are just a string that we write in our class name by using the reserved namespace qualifier, which means that they don't have to follow the directory structure. They have their own structure. They can have the same name like the folder, the models and the user, and here the model and the user, but that is not a requirement. They could have a completely different structure than the folders they are in. And this is very useful if we are using, for example, some external libraries. That way we don't have to worry where we are storing them in our system. We can just identify them with something like this active record, for example. We just know that everything that has to do with active record is stored in our active record namespace, right? And that is everything that we care about. We don't care where it is stored in our web server. It could be stored in some special folder that we have, like libraries or third-party libraries or something like that. But all that we care about is that it is inside of our active record namespace, right? That way we know that we just need to use the active record reserve namespace and get all that has with active record to do. One thing to keep in mind though is that namespaces, just like folders, when we start using them, we need to think about all the levels of them. And some classes could be inside the root namespace as well. For example, this group and this page, they are inside the root namespace. Even though they are physically in some other folder here like models pages, their namespace could be the root namespace. However, root namespace is usually reserved for the PHP's own classes like datetime, etc., or working with database. But it is a thing to consider because sometimes you might wonder why is your class not working or not being loaded if it's in the root namespace. Now, usually namespaces follow the directory structure, at least according to the latest PSR4 standard, which is mostly recommended these days. But let's get back to our problem of duplicate files. So for example, in our code, we could have one class that's being called group as we shown before. So there is one group over here and there is one more group from here. But if you notice, this group is for the pages because this file is the models page group and this file is models user group. However, they are both called groups, so we cannot just say a new group. We have to use the namespace and we use it by writing this keyword namespace and then defining the namespace that we want to use basically. If we follow our folder structure, then it will be the same. It will be models users and then inside of our file, when we need to use this group, we can just say new models user group and the same here for the models page, right? We just use the models page and again models page group. And that way we can identify that this group is actually this class from here and this group is basically this other class here. Again, the similar way as the folder path would be. And to make this even easier so that we don't have to type each time the full name of the class, especially if we are working with singletons, this could be a bit cumbersome. We can use the reserved use keyword, which is basically this way of asking PHP to import all of these classes for us. It is basically importing another namespace in our current file so that we can write this easier. So by using this use, PHP will allow us to just import this group class from here, from the models username namespace, and also this group file from here from the models page namespace, right? And that's all there is to use keyword. The use keyword is just to make it easier for us to work with different classes from different namespaces. And note that in this particular case, since we have two classes with the same name group, we cannot say still name group here, the new group, sorry. We have to make an alias, and to make an alias we just use this as page group, and then in our code we just use that page group alias to identify which group is actually corresponding to which class, right? Otherwise we again end up with two classes with the same name, which is again not possible. But now back to our initial problem of auto-including files. This namespacing here can actually tell PHP which files or where is that file positioned, the file that we want to include automatically. Of course, if we use this PSR4 standard, that is actually recommended, where namespaces match the folder structure, like this example where this namespace matches this folder structure, right? We can actually tell PHP that when we call this models user group, it should go into the models user group file and include that file for us. That way we never ever have to use the include or require again. That is pretty much all there is to namespaces and to using this use keyword. It is just a way of telling PHP where your files are and in which namespace you are working right now, so that the PHP has a reference to all the other files. Does this explanation make any sense? Please write me a comment if it helped you or if it didn't help you. and you think I can explain this a bit better, and I kindly ask you to subscribe to my channel and maybe even share this video on your favorite platform if you liked it. Let's fix this now in our application. So we can also use the PSR4, which is a convention. There are a few others, so you can use your own, but this one is recommended here, so let's change this so that it follows the PSR4 convention. There are some other conventions, you can make up your own, but this one is recommended, so we are going to use it here as well. So if we would to Google for the PHP PSR4 namespace, it talks about all the specifications and everything that's happening, but for example, it here gives the how to classify the class names and where the file should be found in the folder. And it even has the example implementation, but I will not focus very much on the PSR4 because this lesson is not about that. I might not even implement it correctly. I will just copy this logic that they have and just put it here. And instead of this base path, we are going to use the root path, and this will be the class name here. So if I would try this code, it will most likely fail, right? But it is not failing because the file is not found. It is failing because the class is not found. And that is because we are now calling this, for example, database connection here from the root namespace or without namespace at all. And we are here sort of expecting to have the namespace with the class name, right? Now there are multiple ways of fixing that. One way of doing that is to actually go inside database connection and define the namespace where this class is being found. Remember, we have to use this namespace keyword to tell PHP that this database is inside our source namespace. So we can just use that as our namespace to show how this works. If I were to refresh now, same problem appears, and that's because inside of our index we are not using that namespace. So we now need to say the source, and even the IDE will help me with that because it understands that there is a namespace and there is a class inside that namespace. So if I would to fix that here as well and try now, we can see that we went over our database, but we are now stopped on the PDO, and that's the case that I was talking about because inside our database connection here we are using the PDO, which is the PHP's own root namespace. So we now need to call that root namespace to go to the next one. Now we are at the controller because PHP doesn't know where that controller is, right? We removed all that auto-loading functionality from the index.php here. So it has to figure out where the file is, and the only way it can figure that out is using the namespace. So that controller is at the same place where our database is, right? Inside of the source namespace. And if we go to our controller, we can actually put the namespace here. Again, the source. Let's check it now. Again, it's failing because this controller is something that we are calling from our page controller here. So here as well, we need to tell PHP which controller we want to use. And then we are back to the template. Now we do the same for the template, and even the IDE can suggest that because it understands that we are using PSR4, and this template is being used inside of our page controller. Inside of our index here where we are creating that one. However, you might notice that we are using now multiple files from the source namespace. And we are now back to the page, and we can now remove this source from here and this source from here, and then from this database connection and this database connection by adding the use or importing them or just saying the use source as the namespace. And even the IDE will help us with the auto-completing the database object, database connection, so that we have it defined here, and we can just do the same thing for the template. And that should work now. The only thing missing is the page, and that is because the page is inside the models. So in our model page, we also need to define the namespace, right? And we are going to use the modules and then the page and the models, because that is where our page is. And since we see the entity here, you guessed it, the entity as well needs to have its namespace in the source. The same goes for the page controller, because here we actually do have two page controllers, one in the admin here and the other one here in the public page controller, right? the exactly same problem that we are now solving with namespaces. And now, since this one is in its own namespace, we need to use the absolute namespaces just as if we would to use the folders, because again we are using the namespaces that match the folders. Let me check. This page controller is not being found because here inside of the index file I am not actually calling this name controller from its own namespace. I could even ask the IDE to fix it for me by using this page controller like this. And in it, we as well need to call this page from its correct namespace, right? So either by appending this page here, or we can just ask this entire controller to use the page and import that namespace for us, the page, right? Let me just quickly fix this entity from the page class. This entity is in the root source entity, right? And we are back to our paging. In practice, we are usually going to use some packaging manager like Composer, and I personally do not remember when's the last time I wrote the include or require statement or even this autoloader, as usually the IDE will write all these namespaces and use statements for us. But if you continue and fix all these files, you can do the auto include with namespaces without even having to think about where the files are. And the best thing is that we have the control over how our classes are organized inside of our application. And now the best homework ever for you. You will have the honor of making yourself a fully functional CMS. Your homework is to make this form persist values into the database with all these variables here that we are sending. So all the changes to the form are being sent to the browser, to the server, and are ending up inside of our page controller here inside this if post var dump here. And we have the active record, right? We have this page. We have the inside of it. We have defined all the database, the table names, We have all the fields that it needs. So we have all these fields matching here in the form, title and the content, right? We have the ID from the URL, and we have the active record, which is capable of reading data from the database with the find and find all. We have all these queries here. So one more method is needed, something like, instead of find, the save method. And in it, you will go over all the fields the similar way that we are going here. You will go over all the fields that the user has written. You will construct this query with prepared statements, of course, and you will execute some query that will actually insert this data into the database, that will update the database. And once we have that done, we basically have a content management system. Not a very advanced one, but hey, from here only the sky is the limit. If you think about it, we went over the pretty much everything that we need for a CMS. We went over the routing. We have a primitive active record that now needs to expand it, obviously. We have the validation. We have administration. And so from here, you should be able to continue on editing, deleting, creating entities, making the CRUD functionality for other modules, etc. And your second homework is to go over and fix all these namespaces. Check all other modules, check all the other URLs, which is a great opportunity to learn what namespaces are and how to use them in real life. So let's sum up what we learned here. We learned that PHP can actually auto-include some files for us. We can register this SPL autoload register, and in it we can define how to include some files, either in the same directory, or if we have a if else's with multiple different directories, it doesn't matter. The PHP will resolve it for us. We also learned that the namespace is a way of organizing our class structure, the similar way as the folders are doing that, so that we can just specifically tell which, for example here, which controller we actually want to use. Not the public controller, but the admin controller. And that way we can also use this autoloader to include exactly the file that we need for us. We also learned that the use statement is similar to the manual include. If we don't want to use the file name like here, we could just say to use the page controller from here and don't have to write the full class name where we are going to use it. Even the IDE can help us with that because it understands what the namespaces are. And now the namespaces are heavily used when working with with packages and libraries from other developers, and of course we want to make our job easier and to reuse some existing code, and for that we will usually use the composer for managing dependencies, and that is something for a future lesson. You can look into the composer yourself if you wish. It comes with the autoloader already configured, which is already following different standards, so it will do this basically for you. You just need to include its autoload and you just write your code as we shown here. And I will continue with this series soon. Meanwhile, please share this video on your favorite Facebook or Quora group, and as usual, here is a joke for you.